Those of us pointing out the fatal flaws in the virus model and germ theory are also warning the world that these false beliefs are going to be used to stage more fake pandemics. The fantastical notion that pathogens are attacking us more than ever was recently given more hot air, with the WHO announcing a new pathogen surveillance network. According to the WHO and other global organisations, this includes a brewing dengue fever epidemic, which will apparently be sparked by, quote, climate change. Less than a week after the WHO news release, Reuters featured a headline: biotech company bets on GMO mosquitoes to fight dengue in Brazil as cases surge.
You can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious!
This is getting pretty wild, so buckle up as we investigate the alleged science behind dengue, including the human studies from the early 1900s that didn't actually show what's been claimed by the mainstream for over 100 years.
Look how much water that collected. We check the yard the whole time now, and I am very paranoid because I think there's 4 strains around at the moment in cans, and especially in this area.
Spoiler alert for this video, as we explain in chapter 6 of our new book, The Final Pandemic. All quote pandemics lead to vaccines, and as you may have suspected, dengue is no different. In the opening act, they let the cat out of the bag, and the product placement begins.
There are 2 vaccines on the market today, but none of them are actually officially recommended by health authorities, at least here in France. The first one is Dengue from Sanofi, and it actually it was shown to be very dangerous in people who hadn't contracted the virus previously. And the second one is from a Japanese pharmaceutical company, Tadeka, but it doesn't work on all strains. Now, just a few days ago, there's revived hope here because following clinical trials in Brazil, once again, clinical trials showed that a vaccine, Butantan DV, it's a single-dose vaccine. It seems to be efficient, and it seems to not have any side effects.
When you want to see what the establishment claims about dengue fever, there is no better place to start than Wikipedia. Their page states that dengue fever is a mosquito-borne tropical disease caused by the dengue virus. We click on the hyperlink, and the dengue virus page says that the virus is the cause of dengue fever. Case closed for Wikipedia, who also claim that the dengue fever page has earned a special star as a featured article by their in-house team for accuracy, neutrality, completeness, and style. So let's move beyond their self-referential nonsense and see the alleged science this is all supposed to be based on. When my husband Mark and I started our research for this video, we reflected on what we were taught about dengue fever when we were doctors in the medical system. Not much at all, because it is said to be a tropical disease, and essentially the only cases seen in New Zealand are those coming from overseas. We were also under the impression that it was quite a deadly disease. However, Wikipedia states that in 2013 there were 60 million symptomatic cases, and given they also claim that 80% of people are asymptomatic, this would equate to a total of 300 million cases. With the purported 13,600 deaths worldwide, this is a fatality rate of 0.0045%. So even on their own terms, we can see that this doesn't even reach influenza levels. Indeed, if we look at this map, we can see that dengue barely makes a blip, as most countries record no deaths, or a couple of deaths per million of the population. The next map from the CDC also reveals something interesting. Although the virus enthusiasts will claim that the pattern is consistent with a tropical disease, why does an alleged virus stop abruptly at borders or across the sea? Of course, when they talk about cases, what does that actually mean? The CDC state that the clinical presentation is typically acute onset of fever, headache, body aches, and sometimes rash spreading from the trunk. So all non-specific symptoms that could be the result of numerous causes. They betray themselves by comparing it to a fictional disease, claiming that dengue viruses and the virus that causes COVID-19 can cause similar symptoms in the early stages. Another contradiction is the claim that approximately 1 in 20 patients with dengue virus disease progress to develop severe life-threatening disease called severe dengue, which is at complete odds with the earlier epidemiology we examined. Maybe allopathic medicine is saving them all. Then we move to the advertised diagnostic testing, where they state that nucleic acid amplification tests, i.e. usually PCR, are the preferred method of laboratory diagnosis. Now, when it comes to interpretation of the result, they like to bet one each way, stating that a positive NAAT result confirms dengue virus infection, followed by a negative NAAT result does not rule out infection.
The experts say the race is as good as over.
Claiming that the amplification of nucleic acids equates to the diagnosis of clinical conditions is a nonsensical notion that we have dissected many times over the past 4 years. Once again, they are alleging that the sequences relate to a virus, and therefore detection of the sequences is both evidence of the imagined virus and further that this is an infectious process and the cause of disease. None of these references point to any evidence that a virus exists, and if we go back to Wikipedia, it states that in 1906 transmission by the Aedes mosquitoes was confirmed, and in 1907 dengue was the second disease after yellow fever that was shown to be caused by a virus. If you have not already seen it, you can watch my video What You Need to Know About Yellow Fever to see why there was no evidence for any virus there. Wikipedia's statement has one citation, an article titled The Dengue Viruses that was published in Clinical Microbiology Reviews in 1990. In this section, Discovery of the Agent and Identification of Vectors, they state that Ashburn and Craig provided the first data demonstrating the filtrable ultramicroscopic character of the etiological agent. This refers to a 1907 paper titled Experimental Investigations Regarding the Etiology of Dengue Fever, and it documents their clinical experiments at Fort William McKinley in the Philippines. Keep in mind the issue of what constitutes a case as we now move into the historical accounts of this alleged specific disease, one that is now said to be diagnosed by tests that did not exist a century ago. When we examine the Ashburn and Craig paper, we can see the germ theory tunnel vision that was influencing the investigators of the time when they reported that McLaughlin examined both fresh and stained specimens of blood, made cultures from blood upon nutrient gelatin, and also endeavoured to secure cultures by partially filling sterilised glass bulbs with blood from a vein and incubating for weeks and even months. In the blood of every case, upon microscopical examination, he found microscopic cocci, red or purplish in colour. However, others rejected the bacterial cause, and in 1903, Graham of Beirut claimed that dengue is caused by a protozoan inhabiting the red blood corpuscles and closely resembling the plasmodia of malaria, except for the absence of pigment. The authors of the 1907 paper rejected this claim and stated that, though many experienced microscopists have endeavoured to do so, none have been able to confirm his results as regards the presence of a parasite in the blood. But we believe that, however much he may have erred in his interpretation of the bodies described by him in the blood. They did, however, agree with Graham's conclusion that mosquitoes were transmitting dengue. More problems with the hypothesis were encountered in 1904 by US Navy doctors Carpenter and Sutton when they studied 200 cases of dengue while stationed in Panama. They made some interesting observations, including the condition's, quote, striking resemblance to influenza. They were rightfully skeptical of their own experiments that involved mosquitoes and blood examinations, but concluded that it is suggested that the causative agent is a small diplococcus or a delicate bipolar staining bacillus, closely resembling Pfeiffer's organism. It is probably transmitted by the respiratory tract, and its virulence is much increased by the presence of the essential meteorologic factors and by overcrowding. Gutierrez and Cartaya then performed experiments in Havana in 1905 and again had no success in attempting to transmit disease between humans with mosquitoes. They also reported that after examining a large series of blood specimens taken from sick individuals, no parasitic agents were observed. The following year, that is 1906, Agramonte, again studying the disease in Havana, was unable to demonstrate any parasite in the blood, nor was he able to transmit the disease by the mosquito. With this series of failed experiments on record, Ashburn and Craig set out to, quote, solve the etiology of dengue and its method of transmission. In one of their experiments, they stated, "We produced a severe attack of dengue by the intravenous inoculation of filtered blood from another experimental case. We have talked about this kind of crazy maneuver previously. Injecting foreign blood into another human or animal is enough by itself to cause inflammatory reactions. This is neither evidence of an infectious condition or a virus. In any case, they reported that there does not occur in the blood of dengue any visible organism, either bacterial or protozoal in nature, which can be considered as the cause of the disease." Their report did actually describe the appearance of Staphylococcus, Diplococcus, and a motile bacillus in the blood cultures, but they described these as contaminants, apparently in order to keep the single germ, single disease paradigm afloat. In the next phase, they performed intravenous injections of unfiltered blood from a dengue case and reported that of 14 volunteers, 7 developed the disease. Those that did not get sick were declared to be, quote, immune to the disease, which introduced an unfalsifiable concept and a fallacy of reification stemming from germ theory. In a staggering lack of scientific thinking, the authors then stated that we were forced to the conclusion that the causative organism must be ultramicroscopic in size. Again, blinded by germ theory, they had decided in advance that there must be a microorganism to blame. Next, they took blood from dengue cases and forced it through a diatomaceous earth Lilliput filter to prevent any bacteria from getting into the filtrate. This was then injected into 2 volunteers, and on the basis that they developed fever and symptoms, it was declared that with regard to these 2 experiments, they also prove that in all probability the causative agent is ultramicroscopic in size. Like most of the previous researchers, the attempt to transmit disease via mosquitoes was also a failure. They released 30 to 50 blood-filled mosquitoes onto each of 9 subjects, but only 1 developed symptoms. Once again, they introduced the unfalsifiable notion of, quote, immunity to explain the failed transmission and made up some stories about attacks producing immunity for a short time. Perhaps like other researchers who have emulated these techniques, they should consider that their injections are using volumes thousands of times greater than what any mosquito could muster. Regardless, the experiments were unscientific as they lacked controls. There was no independent variable, i.e. their imagined virus, that was simply assumed to be present. On that note, the word virus pops up in their discussion, but in the time they wrote this, they were referring to a vague submicroscopic entity rather than the modern conception. Additionally, it was based on a grand total of 2 experimental cases that had been injected with filtered blood mixtures to exclude bacteria. Why did they not perform comparable experiments involving the injection of blood said not to have the dengue virus? Remember, Wikipedia had claimed that in 1906, transmission by the Aedes mosquitoes was confirmed, and in 1907, dengue was the second disease after yellow fever that was shown to be caused by a virus. We have just examined the foundational evidence that has been cited and can see that neither of these claims were established.
Let me just tell you what I think about it. I think it was a disgraceful performance from a captain who got his sums wrong today, and I think it should never be permitted to happen again.
All of the claims that a virus exists fall back to a few papers like these, and an entire mythology and industry has been built upon such dubious science. The dengue viruses article we started with that cited these original papers goes on to state that the development of a mouse infection model ushered in the modern era for study of the dengue viruses. Dengue viruses may infect mice by a number of routes, but the intracranial route is the most sensitive, especially in 1 or 2 day old suckling mice. This refers to the technique employed by Albert Sabin and others from the 1940s onwards. They found that in uncontrolled experiments, they could kill abnormal albino neonatal mice by injecting mixtures they asserted to contain viruses directly into their brains. Because they had a higher kill rate in the very youngest baby mice, in more pseudoscientific thinking, they concluded that this indicated the, quote, importance of using young mice for routine passage. The dengue virus's authors ran with this nonsense, and in the section Laboratory Diagnosis stated that dengue viruses have been isolated from patient specimens by using suckling mice, cultured cells, or live mosquitoes. However, none of these papers demonstrate the isolation of anything. They all involved mixing patient specimens with something else, whether that be a mouse brain, a cell culture in a test tube, or a mosquito, and then writing the word isolation or isolated in their papers. There are 6 pages in the middle of the dengue virus's review paper claiming to report on virus genomics, proteomics, structure, cell entry, and replication. This is all complete speculation, as they never demonstrated a virus in the first place. The various proteins and genetic sequences have never been shown to be disease-causing or infectious, let alone come from a virus. At least the authors admitted that pathological examinations of skin lesions from classical dengue fever patients have shown swelling of endothelial cells of small vessels, perivascular edema, and infiltration of mononuclear cells. However, neither virus nor viral antigen has been detected in biopsy materials. This is something that we have pointed out many times. If the claimed virus is inside the patient and making them sick, how is it that no viruses can be seen when the tissue is examined? This is what we made clear in the Settling the Virus debate statement in 2022, and it is why virology cannot be considered scientific. To avoid this crucial problem, the virologists claim that the viruses only appear in their indirect laboratory experiments. We invited them to perform these experiments in a controlled and blinded manner to show the world that their techniques have internal consistency. We have seen enough to know that they have failed even with this indirect evidence.
Perhaps their judgment and their skill is blunted. Well, perhaps they might advance that as an excuse for what happened out there today. Not with me, they don't. I think it was a very poor performance, one of the worst things I have ever seen.
What about the images of the purported virus, some may ask? Well, this is a computer-generated fantasy model that cannot be taken seriously. This is a real transmission electron microscopic image on the CDC's website with the claim it depicts a number of round dengue virus particles. This point and declare game is an old trick used by the virologists. For a further explanation of many of the problems with such images, please watch my video on electron microscopy. As the CDC give no useful scientific information, we need to consult PubMed directly and find a source electron microscopic study. There we find a 1994 study titled Ultrastructural Aspects of Virus Replication in One Fatal Case and Several Other Isolates from a Dengue Type 2 Outbreak in Rio de Janeiro. Straight to the methods section, and we can see that the quote virus isolation was carried out by inoculation of human acute phase sera, i.e. blood components, in monolayer cultures of C636 Aedes albopictus, which are mosquito cells. The cultures were observed for 2 or 3 days until cytopathic effects or cellular breakdown appearances were observed, and the samples were then fixed for electron microscopy. We are supposed to believe that the arrows are pointing to dengue virions, when at no stage were the biological function or composition of these particles demonstrated. And don't be fooled if someone sends you one like this. They are from a biotech company calling them virus-like particles, and they are producing refined protein complexes. Although the proteins may be purified, they have never been shown to come from a virus, as we have already been over. In any case, they are not claimed to be viruses. Another contradiction that appears in the dengue virus's article is the statement, although dengue fever was eliminated from the southern United States in the 1920s after populations of the vector mosquito were controlled, followed by, because the principal vector mosquito A. aegypti is found throughout the southern United States, indigenous transmission of dengue in these areas is possible. So the mosquitoes have been around the whole time by all accounts. In summary, the entire official story of dengue fever is full of holes. We have a non-specific disease that is said to be dangerous and at the same time has a lower overall fatality rate than the flu. We are supposed to believe that mosquito transmission was scientifically established, and yet most of the researchers in the early 1900s could not demonstrate this, resorting instead to uncontrolled experiments that involved the direct injection of disease samples into human volunteers. Then we have mosquitoes all over the world and millions of travellers, yet most developed countries do not apparently see dengue spread further as it stops at borders. But watch out if the officials turn up in your neighbourhood with disinfecting chemicals, as they do in the Philippines, and even in Trieste, Italy, last year. Amongst all this, one thing we can say for sure is that they have never demonstrated that any of this relates to a virus. Of course, people get sick, but blaming it on imaginary viruses is a dead end for improving health. It is a path that simply leads into germ theory nonsense and the plans for more vaccines. You can also read my article, The Lyme Disease Lie, as an example of bacteria and tick bites being blamed for a non-specific entity with no sound science at all. Accepting a label like dengue or Lyme disease pulls one right back into the allopathic medical paradigm. Take control of your own well-being, address the real causes of illness, and do not outsource your health to industries and institutions pushing fear narratives, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals.
Oh, baby. How good was that point? Look at the disguise here. Federer shapes cross-court, gives him the no look.
If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com